The term asylum is the term that we use in general to describe when people are afraid to return to their home countries. In the context of immigration law, asylum, withholding and removal, and protection against um, torture are all three types of asylums that a person could apply for. They're all slightly different. The asylum process is an affirmative asylum process and a defensive affirmative process. Affirmative asylum process is for those people who come to the United States and they have a fear of returning to their home country. They may file an application for protection with the government, and that's called an affirmative asylum application. On the other hand, a defensive asylum application is where a person is in a situation where they're in a deportation proceeding or removal proceeding, and they're being threatened with being removed. They can apply for asylum as a protection from being removed. So one is a defense if you're in removal proceedings, and the other is if you're not in removal proceedings. I want to talk about the affirmative asylum process. The affirmative asylum process is where you complete an asylum application, you provide a declaration describing why you fear returning to your country. Perhaps you were the victim of some past harm. You'll describe that harm and explain why you believe you'll be harmed if you were to return. It's important to have an attorney when you're preparing that application because, in addition to your personal story as to what may have happened to you or why you may fear, there's also an objective aspect of it. There's a legal aspect of it. And that's where, in addition to one's story, you have to explain how that particular set of circumstances qualifies for asylum. And that's why it's beneficial to have an attorney. The attorney can advocate for you in the preparing of that application and can present you at an interview and a closing statement, which explains why you should warrant a grant of asylum. Now, when you apply for asylum, there have been some policy changes affecting how those applications are processed and the length of processing time. Depending on where you're at in the country, it used to be that processing time could take several years before you would get an interview. However, recent policies are now, recent applications are being adjudicated first. And so if you file an application recently, you can anticipate having an interview with an asylum officer anywhere between a month and 6 months, sometimes a little longer, but most times very, very quick. Therefore, if you're applying now, it's extremely important to make sure that application is right on point because you only get one opportunity to tell your story. And so it's important to have that application on point that's not only telling your story, but it's explaining legally why you should be granted that application. Now, for those people who have applications that were filed before, those applications are in a queue. They're pending. They're pending to be called for an interview date. And now with the policy changes, many people have experienced delays in having an interview date. It's possible to expedite that with the assistance of an attorney. You can file a request to expedite your asylum application to get an interview date, but you have to provide legitimate reasons on why it's necessary that you have an asylum interview as soon as possible. The asylum interview process is extremely important. You'll receive a notice scheduling you for an interview. It's important to make sure that you attend that interview. If you reschedule that interview or fail to make that interview, it could result in your claim being a negative impact in your claim, it being referred to an immigration judge for a removal proceedings. But once you attend that asylum that asylum interview, you'll meet with an officer. It's a non-adversarial process, so they're basically asking you questions, reviewing your application with you to determine whether or not you should warrant an approval or not. It's important to have an attorney in that process because the attorney role is to prepare you for the interview, is to make sure that your application is well documented, to make sure any new country conditions or supplements are filed, make sure there's a memorandum explaining not only your story but the law, making sure all that's prepared. Also, during the course of the interview, your attorney can be present at that interview, taking notes, listening intently, and then also helping you to address any concerns that the officer may have or any omissions that you may make. What I like to do in asylum interviews, at the end of the interview, I would just summarize the claim for the officer, and I would explain why my client's claim warrants a grant of asylum, not just factually, but under the law. Many times, asylum officers aren't attorneys, and so it's very helpful to have an attorney to explain what provisions of the law, what cases make this case a strong case for approval. And many of the officers appreciate that. Otherwise, they will have to make that determination themselves, and sometimes it may not be the determination that the person wants. So that's why it's very helpful to have an attorney in that process. Once that officer completes the interview, what happens after that, you will get a notice to return. It's usually in about a week or 2 weeks. And once you return, you'll be given the decision of your interview. If it's an approval, you'll get a notice of an approval. If it's not an approval, you don't get a denial, but you'll get a referral over to an immigration court where you'll get a second opportunity to present your claim. And in that process, it's critical to have an attorney because that is an adversarial process. But to avoid having being placed in removal proceedings, to avoid your application being referred over, it's very important that in the beginning of the process that you have an attorney to assist you. And while you're in the affirmative asylum process, to have an attorney to guide you through that so you can have the most favorable outcome. So many of my clients who apply for asylum, I'm assisting them from the very beginning up through the entire process. But I will get clients who will come in who have already filed an asylum application, and they either want to expedite it or they want to make sure everything is in line, and they want representation during the interview process. And so when I typically review those applications that were prepared by perhaps another attorney or by the individual themselves, there's always an opportunity to make that application stronger with a memorandum, with the most recent case law, and also an opportunity to prepare an individual for that interview. Because as I stated, it is one opportunity to tell your story, and so it's important to get it right, not just the facts of your story, but the law needs to be properly presented to the officer.